Hello, my name is Vincent Reid. I'm a reader in developmental cognitive neuroscience at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. This tells you immediately that I'm not a roboticist. I'm actually a developmental psychologist. So I'm here to talk to you today about social development. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Autonomous Mental Development Technical Committee for creating the Developmental Robotics lecture series. I think this is a very worthwhile project. So, let's talk about development and social development. What makes a being a social being? As you may know already from watching other lectures in this series, in order to understand the often complex processes that we see in adult interaction, what we really need to do is to understand what happens during development and to look at these processes and their fundamental basis within infancy. What do we mean when we talk about social development? On one level, we can identify some processes that form the basis of our ability to act socially. Humans can recognize basic emotions easily. Humans understand communicative cues like pointing or like gaze direction. Finally, we can predict others' behaviors on the basis of tangible cues, things that we can see. So, for example, if someone picks up a phone, we can predict that they're going to talk into it most likely. These abilities are only a sampling, and they illustrate the very basics in social processes. When we think about the social adult, we know that emotion is not just about recognizing, say, a facial expression, but about understanding why someone feels a certain way, or predicting how someone would react emotionally in a certain situation. And there are emotions beyond the basic ones, and these have been conceptualized as social emotions. For example, shame is an emotion that's elicited because our behavior has caused certain thoughts or emotions in another person. We don't recognize others' shame from a basic expression on their face, for example. We recognize it by knowing the social constraints of a situation and taking the perspective of those involved. Indeed, simulating another person's mental states, whether that be emotions or thoughts, affect or cognition, builds upon the basics of identifying communicative cues and predicting behaviors as well. This type of perspective taking is known as theory of mind and refers to an ability to understand that others don't have the same knowledge or representations as oneself. So, what this means is that thoughts and general mental states will be different in other people, and you must understand this as an individual. So, a key example that is often failed, if you like, by children up to around 4 years of age and children with autism is that of the false belief task. So in this particular example, Sally, as a person, she puts a marble into a basket and then she leaves the room. Anne moves the marble from the basket to the box. When Sally returns, the question is, where will she look for her marble? Now, of course, there's been an awful lot of work on this, not least because it's linguistically complex. Perhaps that's why younger children fail to pass such tests in terms of false belief. But nonetheless, the key point is this. As adults, we know that Sally will look in the basket. We understand that her mental state is separate from our own, and we can see the distinction. We understand that the beliefs, in other words, of another person do not have to reflect current reality. Theory of mind is the paradigm-altering change in social development that allows children to mind read. But to understand social development holistically, what we need to do is figure out how we get to the stage where we can infer the beliefs of others. In other words, we need to look to precursors for theory of mind. We need to return to the basics. Neonates show some abilities that indicate an early preparedness for social communication, for social perception, and for interaction. Perception of facial identity is an important aspect of social interaction. The ability to recognize who it is you're talking to and consequently access the information you hold about that particular person. Infants' visual architecture is simply not prepared for this, as they can only see in low resolution, dark and light contrasts. Of course, this kind of biological constraint may not apply in robotics, but it does shed light on the different processes that are used. Infants cheat and they use cues like smell and voice to recognize their primary caregivers. And when forced to use visuals, they rely on regions of high contrast like the hairline. Even though neonates have not undergone the visual development necessary for perceiving the facial identity of others, it is thought that they have some pre-existing sensitivities to the human face. They show a preference for faces over head-like stimuli with scrambled or no features, and it's likely that this preference is driven by a preference for top-heavy stimuli, as infants spend longer looking at the slightly abstract face-like stimuli on the left than on the stimulus on the right. So the possibility of a very early face detection system works around the constraints of the neonate visual system. Quite simply, newborns prefer to look at things where there's more visual information in the upper than the lower visual field, and it just happens to be the case that the human face has such a configuration. Neonates can also detect differences in gaze direction. They spend longer looking at a photograph of a person with open eyes when contrasted with a photograph of someone with eyes closed. They also spend much longer looking to pictures of faces with direct gaze relative to averted gaze. In these cases, it's likely that they're relying on the high contrast between the sclera and the iris or pupil. From very early on in life, infants are equipped for dyadic interactions, that is, face-to-face interactions with another individual, and they're sensitive to this kind of social and communicative cue. They are sensitive to when a person is attending to them and communicating with them even in the absence of speech. This means that gaze is a very salient social signal. Neonates might not be interested in averted gaze when contrasted to direct gaze, but only slightly later in infancy, understanding that averted gaze might mean something becomes quite important. Between 2 and 4 months of age, infants will follow an adult's gaze towards a toy. Later on, they only follow an adult's gaze when they know that the adult can see. In this study, the infant would not follow gaze when the adult was blindfolded, which means they understood that adult gaze had some meaning. Although you might think that pointing is similar to directed gaze, infants do not follow pointing actions until around, say, 12 months of age. This makes sense as pointing is intrinsically a symbolic action. This action itself means nothing unless you know that it means something, therefore it is a symbol. It has no meaning in and of itself unless you understand the meaning of that symbol. However, infants do exhibit differences in brain activity to hands pointing at objects versus hands pointing away from objects from around 8 months of age, which indicates there are some proclivities to understand what pointing can do prior to this time. In infancy, we see qualitative differences in how infants process their surroundings, with and without input from other people, and this is a key aspect of how infants learn. This triadic interaction involves a communicative partner, usually an adult, attending to another object in the environment, and the infant following the attention of the partner. The capacity for triadic interactions is present from at least 6 weeks of age, indicating that despite being complex, rudimentary aspects of triadic interaction are operational from very early on in development. In this example, the 6-week-old will look longer towards an adult who is alternating gaze with an object when compared with control conditions. Often the partner will engage in ostensive cueing, that is, using mutual gaze, infant-directed speech, to guide the infant's attention to an object. Triadic interactions are an explicit and a transactional means to communicate about the environment with responses that are contingent to the reactions and the social information that is shared by the social partner. This means it's a very rich way through which infants can learn about the world. There are neural differences in how infants process objects when adults are gazing at or away from those objects. A peak in electrical brain activity associated with attention in infancy will be slower in 4-month-olds when the adult's looking away from an object than when the adult is looking at an object, suggesting that this kind of gaze cueing facilitates a more rapid or more efficient encoding of new objects by the infant. So looking at brain patterns is certainly a very valuable way through which we can understand early development and early social development in particular. Ostensive cueing is a kind of holistic triadic interaction in which an adult uses infant-specific cues, such as mutual gaze or pointing, infant-directed speech, and calling the infant's name. Importantly, when there is an eye contact between an adult and an infant, as well as direct gaze at a novel object, there then become differences in the infant's neural activity in response to viewing the novel objects relative to when the adult doesn't make eye contact with the infant. In other words, this interaction with the eyes somehow has facilitated the way in which the infant processes information about the object and subsequent displays of that object. This negative component of the event-related brain activity associated with attention happens to be larger in the eye contact condition when contrasted with the no eye contact condition. This suggests that the infants attribute greater attentional resources to the new object. Likewise, activity in the 5 to 7 Hz range of electrical brain activity is larger for this kind of mutual attention condition, and this suggests that the infant is encoding something about the object in a different way. In short, having a social component in learning about their environment seems to enhance an infant's learning capacities and their ability to learn about what is going on in the environment. I mentioned earlier that the peak, if you like, of social development in infancy and early childhood is cognitive theory of mind, which is the ability to simulate the internal belief state of another person. Generally, it's assumed that this ability doesn't emerge fully until 4 years of age, but certainly some precursors are very evident throughout infancy. When infants watch an adult going about their everyday life, what the infant does not see is a nonsensical stream of actions and objects. Infants understand that actions have goals. For example, even at 6 months of age, when infants observe a person reaching for a cup, they look to the mouth in anticipation, even if the actual end result of the action is a cup going towards the ear. The infant, in other words, has a representation of the action, either from their own experience or from observation of others, that the cup will go to the mouth. It might be an associative representation rather than any form of complex social cognition, but it does show the beginnings of an understanding of others' goals, and that goals have intrinsic meaning. At 5 to 6 months of age, infants who are shown an actor repeatedly reaching for a toy, such as a ball, will exhibit surprise and will look longer at a scene in which the actor reaches for a bear instead of the ball than one in which they reach for the same ball again but in a different location. So it's not just about having some sort of association between an object, like a cup, and the location of its use in the mouth. There is something more than this. Reinforcing the idea that there is something social about this representation of goals, Amanda Woodward and colleagues showed that 6-month-olds don't show the same pattern of looking at the different action outcomes when a stick touches the object instead of a human hand. So there's something about the fact that it's a human hand that means that infants are sensitive to the notion of goals within these paradigms. Another study replicated this effect with 9-month-olds and a claw on the end of a handle, but showed that if the 9-month-olds had previously been shown that an adult operated the claw, then they would show an identical pattern of looking to the claw's behaviour as they did to the adult grasping the objects. This strongly reinforces the idea that this perception and anticipation of goals is a form of social cognition and is not simply a series of associations. From this research, we can see that goals use social cues from adults, such as eye gaze, to structure their learning about objects in the environment. They form associations between objects and what adults do with those objects, and those associations are specific to animate beings and do not apply to inanimate objects. So from the middle of the first year, infants are exhibiting an ability to predict the outcome of actions from cues, like the objects used in those actions. This is not theory of mind. The infants are not reasoning about the beliefs and desires of the adults. However, it is a form of social cognition, and consequently these abilities may lay the foundations for theory of mind later in life. Simulating the mental states of others would not be possible if we couldn't use overt cues like gaze, pointing, reaching, grasping, and acting with objects to infer those mental states from other people. These are the building blocks that then lead on to more complex forms of social cognition. Now, imitation is a very hotly debated and contested topic within the developmental sciences, so to present it in one slide is a little bit cheeky, but it is a key component of infant learning. One idea behind imitation is that infants perceive others as being like themselves. initially by perceiving similarities in their own movements, their own motor repertoire, and then the actions of those around them. So they perform a visual correspondence, they associate that with an action that's being performed, and somehow there's some interaction between these different factors. It involves mapping perception onto action and vice versa. Infants do seem to perceive when there is an equivalence between their actions and the actions of another person. Imitation illustrates that as well as being able to disentangle others' beliefs from our own, we need to see the equivalences between other people and ourselves, and the fact that others also have internal states and motivations. So imitation goes right back to the false belief task. Representing Sally as oneself is one way to determine what Sally does or does not know. What does the social development of infants tell us about how to design social robots? Well, some things that are important for social development, such as recognizing others from their face, are not necessarily supported by neural hardware from birth. Neonates also use other pathways like smell and sound to recognize others, such as their parents, but they appear to have perceptual bias towards face-like stimuli that may support later social development of the neural hardware for more advanced forms of face processing. So in other words, development unfolds in a way that isn't necessarily linear. It's something that is a bit more transactional in nature, which is why some of the recommended reading related to this lecture is to do with understanding epigenetic landscapes. They also rely on multiple kinds of cue: infant-directed speech, pointing, gaze, to recognize important communication from others. So it's not as if there is one cue that they perceive in the environment. There are multiple cues that are perceived. And consequently, what this means is that there are different forms of information that are perceived and interpreted in order to have social understanding. The simulation of others' internal states is challenging, so infants usually use overt cues, such as an adult's reaching, to anticipate a later outcome, such as grasping an object. They may also map others' actions onto their own before they map others' beliefs and perspectives onto their own. So there are developmental progressions that are related to different forms of cognitive processing throughout early development. As an aside that may be of interest to students of developmental and social robotics, 6.5 model infants anticipate that humanoid robots will behave like human adults. That is, when infants see a humanoid robot avoiding an obstacle, they don't expect it to move in the same way when the obstacle is removed, but instead they anticipate that it will take a direct path. In other words, they assume, somehow, that there is logic to the actions of the robot. They don't show this pattern when it's a box doing the moving, which suggests that there are some cues towards animacy that the infants can attribute to human robots, that lead them to view the robots like animate agents, or like adults. Consequently, we see that this kind of perception of others' goals is not restricted to conspecifics, or people exactly like infants and adults, and infants may be able to respond to social cues from robots. And so on to some concluding comments. Well, it's clear that social cognition relies on an interplay between perceptual mechanisms and cognitive process. These factors need to be understood in isolation and in conjunction with social information. How is social information privileged or different to other forms of information? That's something that's currently being investigated as a key question in this particular field. This concludes a whirlwind lecture on key aspects of early social development. I'd like to thank you for staying until the end. I'd like to thank the funding agencies that have allowed me to make this presentation, and I'd like to thank Anya Neerkushtala for her assistance in making this presentation happen. Thank you, and goodbye.